Alright, history fans, welcome to another exciting lecture here in History 17B. In our most recent lectures, we have been examining race and the modern civil rights movements, the efforts of racial minorities to challenge discrimination and create a more free and equal American society. That was our first introduction to the social movements of the post-World War II era. Here in this lecture, we're going to expand our notion of civil rights and dive deeper into the social movements of the post-World War II period by examining some other social protest movements, some other reform movements of this era, namely the counterculture, feminism, and the efforts of sexual minorities as well to create a more just, free, and equal America. At the end of this lecture, bringing in the insights from last week, you should have a good understanding of how concussive, convulsive this period truly is in American history, where simultaneously, alongside the efforts of racial minorities in the civil rights movements we examined last week, you also have the efforts of the counterculture, feminists, gay rights activists, a variety of other social movements in America that make the 1960s, the 1970s, a time of remarkable social change. So, with that introduction, let's dive into a deeper understanding of the social transformations of the post-World War II era. In the late 1940s and through the decade of the 1950s, there was a great emphasis on consensus in American society, American culture, in American politics. The idea that we Americans should rally around our leaders, rally around the flag. America had just survived the two crises of the early 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. America was in the beginnings of the Cold War, where we were contesting the Soviet Union and asserting the United States as a beacon of liberty around the globe. And as a result, there's this great emphasis on the idea that all is right in America. That's what I mean by consensus, this idea that we could all rally around this notion of the United States as a beacon of liberty, freedom, and opportunity. In contradistinction to the Soviet Union, America had proven its mettle, its worth through the challenges of the Great Depression and World War II. The economy was rebounding. All is right in America. And this manifests in many ways in American politics, society, and culture. There was widespread agreement by the two major political parties in regards to Cold War policy, whether it was the Democrat Harry Truman or the Republican Dwight Eisenhower. American presidents and American political parties in this period agreed on Cold War policy in the early containment era. In American society and culture, you had the saccharine sitcoms of Leave It to Beaver in the 1950s with these visions of happy life in the comfortable suburbs that also seemed to reinforce the idea that all is right in America. So the consensus in the 1940s and 1950s was one that emphasized conformity. It emphasized this idea that we should all live this American dream, recognize America as this beacon of liberty and freedom. All is right in America. We could enjoy this relative post-war prosperity which validated consumer capitalism. But by the 1950s and 1960s, there developed increasing critiques of this notion that all is right in America. In the late 40s and 1950s, a lot of that critique of the consensus vision of America came from subcultures or countercultures, beatniks, urban intellectuals. But by the early 1960s, that critique of the consensus culture in America, that critique that all is right in America, began to expand and go mainstream. Some of these critiques we've already encountered in previous lectures. We talked in our lecture on the Cold War about the anti-Vietnam movement and its critique of our slavish devotion to containment, which brought us into that ruinous war that proved so ruinous, not only taking the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers, not only taking the lives of millions of people in Southeast Asia, but also aggrandizing the power of the political system, pitting Americans against each other, And so the American war in Vietnam, its outgrowth from the containment policy, sparked this backlash that argued no, not all is right in America, that our slavish devotion to containment brought us into this ruinous war. It's had deleterious effects on the lives of Americans and American society, and we need to end the war and change our Cold War policy. More recently, we have seen other protests against this idea that all is right in America, launched by racial minorities who argued America is not a beacon of freedom and equality and opportunity, as we like to believe, that many American citizens in this nation are denied access to an education, access to an American dream often defined by consumer capitalism, a house in the suburbs. Racial minorities couldn't buy a house in the suburbs in the late 40s and 1950s. In fact, there were deliberate efforts to forbid them from doing so and foreclose that American dream. And that's why economic liberty and economic freedom was so crucial and vital to the civil rights efforts we examined last week. Also, racial minorities argued that America is not a beacon of equality, freedom, and opportunity because they were denied the right to vote, denied the right to be free and equal members of the American nation. They didn't even have an ability to protect their very bodies from violence, as we saw backlashes against the modest efforts of civil rights activists towards a more equal America, how they indeed manifest in beatings and the death of many brave Americans. So the civil rights movement was also a critique of this idea that all is right in America, launched by racial minorities who were brave and willing to challenge this idea, to argue that America had denied freedom and opportunity and equality to its own citizens, many of whom were veterans of World War II, the Korean War, the American War in Vietnam, who had sacrificed and served this nation, but yet were denied its virtues. So our lectures last week also represent a certain critique of the idea, that consensus culture, that all is right in America. Here in this lecture, we will now introduce other American citizens who also argue that no, all is not right in America, that there are inequities in our society, in our political system, in our broader culture that prevent us from being full and equal members of this nation. We will talk about the counterculture, broaden beyond the anti-Vietnam movement, and talk about the efforts often of young people in the 1960s to create a more libertine, free society that recognizes the rights of individuals to live as they choose. We'll talk about American women, feminists, who also push back against the confines that they find themselves within that limit their freedom, their opportunity to pursue a life of their own making. We will examine in this lecture the modern feminist movement of the post-World War II period, which develops right alongside civil rights, employs many of the same techniques as civil rights activists, and also seeks the same goals: freedom, equality, opportunity. And then we'll conclude this lecture with yet another social movement that emerges out of the 1960s, gay rights, the efforts of sexual minorities who also want to be free and equal members of the American nation. So this lecture now introduces these three other social movements, and in doing so demonstrates how America in the 1960s is awash in a great spasm of argument and contention as part of the broader story of American history as an argument without end about the nature of freedom, who is an American citizen, and what defines this nation. In the 1960s, members of these groups asserted their place within the American nation and sought to remake an American nation into one that was more free, equal, and open. Let's begin with what we may describe as the counterculture, the efforts of young people who are pressing against the world their parents made in the 40s and 50s and aspiring to a new America in this era of social protests. The most important of the student protest movements and advocacy groups of the 1960s was the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. It was first formed on the campus of the University of Michigan in 1962, where student activists pressing against, again, that confining, conformist vision of America in the 1950s that urged slavish devotion to the flag and leaders, urged us to accept the idea that all is right in America, young people born into that world in the early 1960s gathered together and authored a manifesto that openly reject that consensus vision. The Port Huron Statement, which you could read in the online textbook for this class, is a scathing indictment of a number of American institutions that the SDS, the student activists, argue are pitted against the interests of the American people. The SDS, in part, argued that the power brokers in American society, the major political parties, corporations, universities, they pursue interests and ends that are divorced from the interests of the many, the people. Look at the name of this group, Students for a Democratic Society. That idea of a democratic society is at the heart of this movement, and their name indicates that they are advocates for creating such a society, indicating they believe that such a society does not yet exist. And the reason why they asserted that is that they argued the institutions in American life, and our politics, and our economy, and our culture are in the hands of a few who are largely unresponsive to the needs and interests of the many. The solution, according to SDS, was to create a truly democratic society where everyone had a voice, where everyone could influence American institutions, and American institutions were more responsive to the American public. The SDS was part of the anti-Vietnam movement. They will stage some of the great protests of this period, and their critique of the American war in Vietnam wasn't just a critique of that war and the policy behind it. It was a critique in line with this idea of an undemocratic America in the hands of power brokers and institutions who pursue something that benefits them, the American war in Vietnam. That is good for certain defense contractors. That's good for certain politicians who aggrandize their power based on the sphere of communism. But who ends up dying in the rice paddies of Southeast Asia? Poor Americans and the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So that is demonstrative of how their critique of the American war in Vietnam isn't just a critique of the war, but it's rooted in their broader sensibilities. They argued if we truly had a democratic society where our institutions of power and authority are responsive to the interests of the people, we would have never had a war in Vietnam, because it is not in the interest of the American public. Instead, the SDS wanted to create a bottom-up revolution where a more participatory society, a participatory democracy would emerge, where everyone could vote, where everyone had a say. The SDS, in addition to its efforts in trying to end the war in Vietnam, will march alongside Dr. King in the civil rights movement, march right alongside Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in the civil rights movement. Many in the SDS were freedom riders who would journey to the South, put their lives on the line to register African Americans to vote. And that was again in line with their larger values. Let's create a society where everyone can vote. Let's create what they argued was a participatory democracy, where everyone has a chance to participate. And if such a society existed, well, we would therefore be able to rightfully call ourselves a democracy. Remember, all this is taking place in the throes and the thickets of the containment era, where America is sending Peace Corps workers around the globe. America is arguing that it is a beacon of freedom and democracy. Well, the SDS says we have no right to say that. Not until we become a true democracy. They are students for a democratic society, implying that we have yet to achieve that. Only when we create this vision of a participatory democracy where all can participate, where everyone can vote or influence the larger societal and political order, only then can we judge ourselves as truly a democracy. They saw it venal that we go around the world in this way, arguing that we're a beacon of freedom and democracy, when we here at home deny our own citizens the right to vote, the right to pursue a life of their own making, or even bodily protection even protection of their very being. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has been consciously denied to so many Americans. The SDS argued it's time to end that and create their vision of a participatory democracy. So this is very indicative of student protest movements of this period, their indictment not just of a war or racism or sexism, but a disease at the heart of America that comes from this divorce between the power brokers and the people. The remedy to that is to empower the people. And so this is a critique of that consensus vision. It's a social protest movement, and it is an effort to dislodge power from a few, corporations, the military, politicians, advertisers, and instead empower the many, workers, students, racial minorities, the people who for so long have been cut out of that American dream. This is their bottom-up revolution. Today, it's a cliche or a laugh line, power to the people. You've probably heard that in sitcoms and movies as a way of reducing the student protest and the idealism of the 1960s to a cliche, to a slogan, power to the people. But for the SDS and the millions of young Americans who will march, who will protest, who will stage sit-ins, who will be arrested and beaten, power to the people wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a laugh line. It was their driving imperative. And in that phrase is again the larger philosophy here. Power to the people indicates that power isn't with the people. That is instead the province of the military, corporations, politicians. The way to create a democratic society was a bottom-up revolution where people who for so long have been denied power rise up, take to the streets, and demand their rightful place within the American nation. And so the SDS was visible and active in all the social movements of this period. Certainly, they campaigned to end the war in Vietnam because the war in Vietnam for them was another symptom of a deeper problem in America. But they also marched with A. Philip Randolph. They also went and registered black voters in the South. They marched with feminists in protesting the way in which women were denied equality and opportunity. So the student activists of this period were involved in the variety of protest movements we are describing at this time because all of them, civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the anti-Vietnam movement, were reflective of the broader philosophy of groups like the SDS. Power to the people, a bottom-up revolution, a truly participatory society. We should not congratulate ourselves as some sort of beacon of freedom and democracy when we have failed to achieve those goals for our own citizens. The SDS was a political protest movement with political goals. But what happens in the 1960s is that what begins as a political movement branches out into a broader critique of American society, seeking a more libertine, flexible, and individualistic field of expression. This is what we mean by the counterculture. As the name indicates, the counterculture was a critique of that mainstream consensus culture of the 1950s that urged everyone to get married, move off to the suburbs, and stare at the TV. Children born into that world would find their parents' world very plastic, inauthentic, and confining. And from that would come this counterculture, where young people in the 1960s will insist on greater freedoms for individuals to pursue a life of their own making. They argued that you're told to follow the rules from your birth. You're told to sit still, raise your hand before you speak, comb your hair like this. You're told by various institutions in American life what you desire from advertisers and marketers who sell a very, again, limited and confining vision of the American dream, a house in the suburbs, a car in the garage. And the net result of this is you are separate from your true self. You become a cog in a wheel rather than a true individual in charge of your own destiny. And so the counterculture tended to view the institutions in American life, whether it was the political parties and politicians, whether it was the military and its devotion to the Cold War and a massive military buildup and martial culture, whether it was marketers and advertisers, Hollywood and television, the counterculture tended to see all of those as manipulative and selling you a false vision. The way to live a true and authentic life is to break free from that and pursue a life of your own making. And so, in the 1960s, the social protest movements, civil rights, the SDS, the anti-Vietnam movement, helped create this countercultural sensibility that urged young people to assess everything around them, to interrogate and challenge the world their parents had made. And if they found that world vacuous, empty, wanting, plastic, inauthentic, to have the courage to break free from that and create something that is truly your own and of your own making. And so the 1960s was an age of the counterculture. It was a period where not only were civil rights activists challenging the existing order, not only were feminists challenging the existing order, not only was this social protest movement against the Vietnam movement building, there was also this change in American culture that embraced a more libertine sensibility that sought different ways of being in the world. So everything was to be questioned. Everything was to be interrogated. As a result, young people dressed different. A more casual form of dress predominated. In the 1960s, for the first time, people began to wear blue jeans every day. Prior to the 1960s, blue jeans were usually worn by people who worked in certain trades, mechanics, or farmers and ranchers. But by the 1960s, blue jeans became part of everyday fashion. And it was indicative of a more casual sensibility prevailing in clothing. If your dad every day woke up and put on a tie and a gray flannel suit and went to his boring corporate job, and you decided that's not for me, you rejected not only his career track and his treadmill existence on the pathway towards success, you also rejected symbols of it, like that gray flannel suit. And so young people wore blue jeans, and this created a much more casual sensibility in America. Now, we've extrapolated that today, so that today, if you're wearing jeans, you're dressing up, right? If you see someone wearing jeans, well, you know, they must be really dedicated to their appearance that day, because, you know, we have just mailed it in at this point. The pandemic hasn't helped, right? People just wearing sweatpants all day. Now, fitness wear is very common. Everyone's always dressed like they're going to the gym, but none of them are going to the gym. They're just going to a gym called Starbucks, evidently, right? So today, you know, it's hard. Pretty soon, everyone will just be wearing their pajamas or some Snuggie all day, right? So we've really extrapolated this beyond what began in the 1960s with the more casual ethic that manifests in things like t-shirts and blue jeans. Today, everyone's just wearing pajamas or fitness wear all day, and you can't tell if someone is going to work or going to bed. But that began in the 1960s and began again as a statement in rejection of the world your parents had made. 1960s was a time of a sexual revolution. The pill is patented in the early 1960s, helping to separate sex from reproduction, and that allowed for greater sexual exploration. In the 1950s, your sexual energy was often urged to be confined to the heterosexual married ideal, the idea that we're all supposed to get married to the opposite gender and go off and live in the suburbs having 2.5 children. Well, in the 1960s, you had a sexual revolution that in part was fueled by greater access to birth control, the deregulation of birth control through the Warren Court, which decriminalized birth control. By the late 60s, early 70s, there are rulings that effectively decriminalize pornography. And so people could pursue their interest in erotica and express themselves as sexual beings who admit to having a libido. And that too was a field of expression of individualism and allowed them to explore their bodies, their selves, in a way that again wasn't limited to that nuclear family ideal. So the 1960s was a time of exploration and experimentation in sex and sexuality. Drug use goes increasingly mainstream. These trends no longer confined to hippies and counterculturalists and people at the margins of American society, but increasingly part of mass society, manifest in our pop culture, as we'll see in our next slide. And that included experimentation with drug use as a way to change your way of thinking, change your sensibility. Drug use was political in the 1960s because it was a rejection of that conformist vision of the 1950s and was often seen as a handmaiden to awakening your true self and sensibilities and breaking free from, again, that treadmill existence where everyone is told to get married, move off to the suburbs, dedicate yourself to some corporate job, and somehow congratulate yourself that you're living the American dream. For the counterculture, the goal wasn't to be like everyone else, conform, wear the gray flannel suit, but instead find out who you truly are. The emphasis here was on a vision of freedom that was defined through personal expression. American history is an argument without end. One of the key arguments in that argument without end concerns the nature of freedom. And at this point in the class, we've seen many different answers to that variable contested question. For the counterculture and many Americans in the 1960s, freedom was defined through personal liberation, individual expression. Again, the idea that there are different ways of being in the world, that we're not all destined to live in the same fashion, that we're not all destined to get married, move off to the suburbs, and stare at the TV. In the consensus culture of the 1950s, that defined freedom. Remember, in that kitchen debate where Richard Nixon pointed at a kitchen and said, "There's freedom." Mixers, blenders, deep freezes. A freedom defined through stuff, consumer capitalism. But in the 1960s, many young people saw those rather than as instruments and elements of freedom, but as confining drags that took away your true self and involved an exchange of your true identity for, again, conformity. The remedy for the counterculture was the pursuit of different ways of being in the world. And so they experimented not just with drugs and dress and language and slang and music, but in different forms of life, rejecting, again, the world their parents had made. Rejecting, in many ways, this idea that you follow a set path from education to career to family life. Instead, the counterculture imagined a broader ken of possibilities. One good example of this, a professor at Harvard in the 1960s, Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a professor at Harvard University, one of those august Ivy League schools, a school that was formed in the 17th century by Puritans as an effort to control who could speak for God. Well, 300 years later on that campus, you had Timothy Leary, a professor, urging his students and all Americans to go on a trip, to take a little acid, to drop LSD. Leary urged Americans to experiment with this drug because he believed it was necessary to indeed liberate the true self, to know one's true self. Leary argued that by the time you reach 18, your brain has been so saturated with messages outside yourself that you don't know who you truly are. For Leary, the irony of American life was when you turn 18, you're presumed to be an adult in charge of your life. You are a fully formed individual who will now go and live a life of his or her own making. But the reality, according to Leary, was you're anything but your true self when you turn 18. Instead, you are the accumulation of all the messages you've received from your parents, from your religious authorities, from your teachers, from advertisers and marketers who tell you who you are. And so when you turn 18, we might imagine yourself as a fully formed free individual, but instead you are a fully formed product of society, a society that Leary and many others in the counterculture saw as inherently corrupt. So the remedy for Leary was to free your mind from all those messages, and he believed the best way to do that was to take LSD. He advocated the use of acid, or LSD, not only because of whatever pleasures may come from taking such a trip, but as remedial, as therapeutic, as a way of breaking free from all the influences that have saddled you and getting in touch with your true self. And again, this is not coming from some weirdo in the back of a van in a parking lot in Riverside. This is coming from a Harvard professor, Timothy Leary. Abbie Hoffman was the leader of a countercultural group known as the Yippies. And they staged events in American life designed to shake us out of our conformity, to see the absurdity of the life we lived, to see the absurdity of the rules that govern our very existence. The Yippies would stage events in public places that drew a lot of attention, and they hoped urged people to indeed see the inauthenticity and absurdity of modern American life. This is the original flash mob. One example of this, the Yippies went to the New York Stock Exchange. And you've probably seen this on TV, brokers yelling into their phones, wheeling and dealing, literally trading billions of dollars each and every day on that chaotic New York Stock Exchange floor. Well, the Yippies went to the New York Stock Exchange. They stood above that pit where the stockbrokers are yelling at each other, transacting billions and billions of dollars across the global economy. And Abbie Hoffman and the Yippies began to throw $1 bills up into the air so that they would rain down on these stockbrokers. And what do these stockbrokers do? These men, and they were almost all men in the 1960s, who probably made hundreds of thousands of dollars a year at that time in the 1960s, who were stewards of this global economy, involved in transactions involving billions of dollars. What do they do when they see a $1 bill? Well, they start to grab at it, and they fight with each other over $1. This is an example of how the Yippies wanted to peel back the veneer and demonstrate how so much of American life, so many of our institutions in our politics, in our society, in our economy are based on bullshit. They're based on nonsense. They are riven with absurdities. And the hope was once you see that all of this is bullshit, you stop eating the bullshit. You stop shoveling it into your mouth. You say, hell no, I'm not going to live that way. And you insist on a way of your own. That's the counterculture. That's what manifests in the sexual revolution, in the Yippies, in the music of this period that often was political, aggressive, sexual, and in doing so offered a scathing critique of conformity and limits of the previous decade. So the counterculture comes out of these political movements. It expands into this broader effort to create a more free America, open to greater possibilities. An America that's more libertine in its sensibilities, that is open to different ways of being. An America that no longer wants to grow up absurd or follow the rules or to believe in an American dream that is so confining and limited. Counterculture may have begun on the campuses of colleges and universities. It may have manifested in truly transgressive figures like Leary and Hoffman, but by the late 60s, it's gone mainstream. Even your parents may start to embrace the more libertine sensibilities of the counterculture. Maybe even your parents are experimenting with drugs and sexuality. And that's because what was once an underground countercultural movement is now making its way into the mainstream, and that is best seen in our popular culture, culture consumed by the masses, in music, in television, in theater. By the late 60s, American pop culture is very different than it was in the early 1960s, when that consensus vision still prevailed, where music was safe, where television offered you those saccharine sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Fast forward just a few years until the late 60s, and everything has changed. Pop culture is very reflective of an age. It's more than just the way we amuse ourselves or distract ourselves. It's a barometer, a measure of American society and culture. And if you look at the pop culture of the late 60s, what Americans were listening to, watching across the silver screen, you see the sensibilities of this counterculture, this scathing critique of conformity. You see it in music, which is often, again, more political, more socially conscious, in tune with the sensibilities of young people, expressing the ideals of civil rights and environmentalist movement, which is also developing here in this period, and the broader sensibilities of the counterculture. Bob Dylan, in his anthem of the 1960s, "The Times, They Are A-Changing," spoke to this generational shift when he sang, "Your sons and daughters are beyond your command." Young people were rising up, protesting the Vietnam War, challenging the existing order, seeing the world their parents had made as plastic and inauthentic. And that is represented in the music that young people were listening to, like "The Times They Are A-Changing." Film was changing as well. The Hollywood studios in the early 1960s were going bankrupt. This was partly due to the challenge that came with television. By 1959, television is in 90% of American homes. It is the fastest technological adoption in American history, faster than the automobile, faster than the personal computer, faster than the so-called smartphone. In the early 1950s, few Americans had a television. By 1959, it's in 90% of American homes. And that meant now you had visual entertainment in your own home. You don't have to go outside the home, head to the local bijou to see visual entertainment through film. That was a challenge to the motion picture industry. But moreover, the movies they were making were not connecting with what was now the growing audience for film, young people, who was still leaving their house to go see visual entertainment in the 1960s. Not old people. They were content to stay home and watch the television, young people. In the early 1960s, the audience for film shifted dramatically towards people under 30, because people older than 30 were again staying home and watching TV. Those people under 30 were rejecting Hollywood films because they were so saccharine. They were subject to what was known as the production code. The production code was first adopted in the 1930s during the Great Depression, during that period in American culture where many were rejecting the sensibilities of the 1920s and looking for films and other expressions in American life that venerated small towns, the little guy, and American institutions. To reflect that, Hollywood decided to clean up its act and adopted this code that limited what could be shown in American movies, banning things like nudity, strong language, or basically anything that seemed to represent transgression or an unorthodox way of thinking or believing. This played a role in that consensus culture of the late 40s and 1950s when the code was still enforced. But by the mid-1960s, Hollywood studios had a harder and harder time holding on to the code because the audience for film was so young, and young people wanted movies that reflected their way of thinking and being. And Hollywood films that still had to adhere to a code that banned frank depictions of American life, drug use, sexuality, didn't fit with the increasing countercultural sensibilities of young people. And so slowly Hollywood begins to change. You could see that in the mid-60s, in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, a scathing critique of Cold War sensibilities, a lampooning of political figures and institutions, and a skewering of the military. In Dr. Strangelove, subtitled, Or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, you have the satire of the Cold War that openly makes fun of the military, something you cannot do in America today. But in the 1960s, in a very different era, the military was subject to this lampooning as part of the Cold War critique coming from Kubrick's film, and in many ways jiving with the growing anti-Vietnam War, anti-containment sensibility that will build into the late 60s. In 1966, Mike Nichols adapted a stage play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, into a Hollywood film starring Elizabeth Taylor. This play, written by Edward Albee, offered a scathing critique of figures of authority. The play, later adapted into a film, focuses on figures of authority you are expected to esteem and admire and emulate, people who are seen as figures of authority and knowledge, people you are urged to admire and emulate. That's right, college professors. But the college professors in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf were anything but people you wanted to emulate. They were pathetic losers. They were drunks. They lived empty, soulless lives. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, first a sensation on college campuses as a stage play, and later adapted into a Hollywood film that played a very key role in helping to break down and ultimately end the production code with its frank depictions of alcoholism, sexuality, offered a scathing critique of the adults in your life, a scathing critique of the rule makers, your parents, your professors, your teachers. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf demonstrates that those people live empty lives. They sold out for that house in the suburbs, and it urges young people, if they want to have a life of meaning, a life that is their own, to reject the world these figures of authority have created. In 1967, two films are nominated for Best Picture that truly represent the counterculture. This is clearly indicative of how by 1967 American society has changed. American society has changed rapidly in this period of change. Civil rights, feminism, the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam movement. And that manifests as far as the august American institution of the Oscars. Even the stodgy, conservative Academy had to respond to the deep currents within American life when the Academy nominated for Best Picture in 1967 The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, two films that were made now after the production code was finally killed by Hollywood studios who could no longer adhere to a code and still win over young audiences who were so deeply influenced by the counterculture. These two films, The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, truly represent how the counterculture had gone so mainstream that they would indeed be nominated for Best Picture by the Academy. Bonnie and Clyde's a story of Depression-era bank robbers, the real life Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, who go off on this wild tempest of bank robberies, seeking to live a life of their own making. Early in the film, Warren Beatty playing Clyde Barrow motors in his car up to a backyard where a young mother is out hanging laundry. That's Bonnie Parker. He opens the door to his car and says, "Hop in." She shrugs her shoulders and then hops in, and we're off for the rest of the film on that wild ride. She rejects that domesticity. She rejects that life of conformity and affirms a life of her own making. Bonnie and Clyde rob banks. They become notorious. They live as rebels. They live as people demanding a world of their own designs. And they die as they live in a hail of bullets. At the very end, a very violent scene, and certainly one of the most violent scenes in Hollywood up to that point, one that could never have been filmed in the production code era. The Graduate, based on a novel of the early 1960s, starred Dustin Hoffman in his first major role. This film was also directed by Mike Nichols, who directed Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and it's a story, unsurprisingly, based on the title, of a college graduate who goes back to sunny Santa Barbara, and wherever he goes, every adult in his life posits the same question. All right, Ben, what next? Are you going to go to law school? Are you going to go to grad school? Are you going to get married? Are you going to job at your dad's firm? What next? So Benjamin, played by Dustin Hoffman, is inundated by adults in his life who are constantly demanding, what's next? Benjamin doesn't know the answer to that question, what's next? But he does know that all those pathways set out for him, get married, buy a house, go to law school, go to work at a corporate firm, he wants nothing to do with. And so he's adrift, literally adrift, in the pool at his parents' home. There's a funny and famous scene where there he is in the pool, and all around him on the rim of the pool are these adults yelling at him to follow the rules, do what he's told. During this time, he gets involved in an affair with the wife of his dad's business partner, the eponymous Mrs. Robinson from the Simon and Garfunkel songs that were written for this film. As he is involved in this affair with Mrs. Robinson, played by Anne Bancroft, who was only a few years older than Dustin Hoffman when the film was made, he falls in love with her daughter, Elaine, his true love. And so he wants to end the affair with Mrs. Robinson and be with Elaine. But he knows that if he ends the affair, Mrs. Robinson will expose the affair and Elaine will find him repulsive. You had sex with my mom? Well, he has to take that risk. And so he breaks off the affair, and Mrs. Robinson makes do on her threat. Elaine is disgusted, and as a result, she's willing to marry the nice boy that her parents have picked out for her, a nice young man who will give her that house in the suburbs and the 2.5 children. And then you get the final scene of the film, one of the most famous scenes in Hollywood history, where Benjamin tries to make his way to the church to stop the wedding. And he pounds on the glass and says, Elaine, Elaine. And before Elaine says, I do, and gives in to that conformist lifestyle that is demanded of her, she leaves her intended groom at the altar, and she runs off with Benjamin into the unknown. As the credits roll, and the film ends with that Simon and Garfunkel classic, The Sound of Silence. That's how the film ends. We don't know what happens to Ben and Elaine. But what we do know is that whatever happens to them, it will be of their own making. They have rejected the world their parents have demanded. They have rejected the world their parents have made. They are going off into the unknown. Very indicative of the spirit of the counterculture that by 1967 is so mainstream, so vibrant and visible in America that it's there in this highly successful film that was indeed nominated for Best Picture. In addition to the efforts of student protests, student activists, the broader counterculture, the 1960s is a time of dramatic change in the form of the modern American feminist movement. Now, when we hear that term feminism, we tend to think of this period, the 1960s, the 1970s. But it's important to note, feminism has always been part of American history and American society, going back to our founding, when at the Constitutional Convention, there were advocates for granting women equality under law and the right to vote. In the 19th century, you had a feminist movement that sought to end slavery, to bring about true equality, not just for the races, but also the genders. We talked about the radical Republicans in our very first lecture, and Thaddeus Stevens was a feminist who advocated not only equality for African Americans, but also American women. In the early 20th century, you had the New Woman ideal and the efforts that led to the 19th Amendment. So feminism has always been part of American history and society. There's nothing more American than feminism. But the feminism of this period, of the 60s and 70s, began, like many of the other movements we've talked about in recent lectures, as a rejection of the limits of the late 40s and 1950s. Containment wasn't just a Cold War philosophy that led to wars in Korea and Vietnam. It had its domestic manifestations as well, in the way in which it urged American women in that containment era of the late 40s and 1950s to contain their energies and ambitions to a life as homemakers and wives. American institutions in the late 40s and 1950s, in that containment era, urged American women to see their role in that way, often in relation to the Cold War, that their job was to raise patriotic little boys and little girls, dedicate themselves to inculcating within little Timmy and little Sally those American values and patriotism. Their role was to be stewards of the home in an age of the 1950s that often celebrated the suburban ideal, that kitchen debate. This manifests in American politics, in school curriculums that urged women into home ec, and American society and culture in those saccharine sitcoms of Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. So in the late 40s and 1950s, in the era of containment of the Cold War, American women were urged to contain their individual ambitions and confine them instead to the home as mothers and wives, to forego an education and career. But then here comes the protests of this period. Civil rights, the counterculture, the ways in which Americans are urged to challenge the existing order, to find it limiting, confining. And in that context, in the early 60s, the modern feminist movement begins. Key event in the modern feminist movement occurs in 1963 with the publication of the Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan, where she describes what she called the problem with no name. And it was a problem with no name because no one had ever identified it as a problem. No one had ever seen it as problematic. What was the problem with no name? Well, according to Betty Friedan, the problem with no name was the way in which American women were denied a freedom to pursue a life of their own making. Betty Friedan was a college graduate, and she describes in her book how despite her career as a journalist, spending all day writing, editing, researching, after a long day of working in journalism as a writer, she was expected to come home and clock in for what she described as her second shift, where she was expected to cook, clean, care for the children, while her husband sat on his ass and drank a martini. Friedan's point was, men are excused from that labor. Men are not expected to cook, clean, care for the children. And as a result, they can dedicate all of their energy, all of their attention to their career. And Friedan, that's why, according to Betty Friedan, that's why men dominate society. It's not because they're smarter. It's not because they are more rational or more capable. It's because they've successfully prevented themselves from having to compete with 50% of the population by saddling women with these duties that culture, society demands of women that men are liberated from. Friedan argues that if it was equal, if men had to shoulder the equal labor of child rearing and housework, well, women would be on the faculty of prestigious universities. Women would be in political institutions. Women would be CEOs of corporations. Betty Friedan argued that society demands of women things that it does not demand of men, and as a result forecloses success, opportunity, and contributions that women can make and pursue. She argued that women should be liberated from these demands so that they could pursue a life of their own making, pursue a college education, a career. And if liberated in that fashion, they would indeed come to be equal members of society and increasingly visible in those institutions of authority. In many ways, Betty Friedan turned out to be 100% correct. Today in America, the majority of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. Whenever we get back on campus, look around your classrooms. You'll see the majority of students at our university are indeed women. Today we have best-selling books titled The End of Men. Are Men Necessary? In many American households, women are out earning men. Now, the pandemic has reversed that, but once the pandemic ends, there's a good chance that that trend will continue. The service sector economy, the information economy that prevails in the 21st century, is one in which women are excelling, thanks in part to the efforts of feminists of the 60s and 70s who worked tirelessly to open up those opportunities in education and employment to American women, and women are seizing those opportunities and now are CEOs of corporations, now are on the faculty of prestigious universities, and increasingly coming to influence American political institutions. So Betty Friedan was certainly on to something. Problem for Friedan was that though her book was a huge bestseller, though she was flooded with letters from American women who said, "Your problem is my problem. I too aspired to a career in education, but had to forego those freedoms and opportunities to sweep floors and wipe poopy butts." Though she had this recognition, though her book really connected with American women, whenever she would pursue a job in journalism, the person on the other side of the desk who ran the magazine or newspaper and had the power to hire her was invariably a man. And he likely hadn't read the Feminine Mystique, but he knew its core argument. Its core argument was the only reason you're there in charge of this magazine or newspaper is because you're scared to compete with us, American women. And as a result, the men who she would interview in front of for such positions failed to hire her. So she had to make her own way in the world. She was one of the founding members of NOW, the National Organization for Women, which remains to this day one of the leading feminist advocacy groups in America, arguing for access to education, equal treatment in employment, equal pay for equal work. Now advocates for reproductive rights, access to birth control, and abortion. It advocates for a variety of reforms that indeed empower women to pursue a life of their own making. Betty Friedan was one of the founders of that advocacy group, still in many ways driving forward the feminist agenda of now the 21st century. She helped found Ms. Magazine, where she could publish. Ms. Magazine became the voice of this growing feminist movement in the 1970s. And from this came legislative change, following a pattern we saw with civil rights, where change comes from federal legislation from the top. In 1963, had the Equal Pay Act that stipulated that women with the same experience and education should be paid the same as men. Now, that has been hard to enforce and remains an ideal yet unrealized, but in 1963, the federal government, during a civil rights era that would see soon a Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Voting Rights Act of 1965, is saying that it is wrong to treat people differently based on sex. In 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act, which, as we described in our recent lecture, was also key to feminism and feminist ideals because it also prohibited discrimination based on sex. That was the product of racist senators and congressmen who added that element to the Civil Rights Act, hoping to sabotage the act, prevent it from being passed, but it passed anyways. And so The Civil Rights Act of 1964 has proven to be instrumental not only in ending discrimination based on race, but also in regards to sex. In the 1970s, you'd have Title IX passed, which was particularly designed to create a leveling of opportunity in places like colleges and universities for American women, obliging those institutions to treat women equal to men in things like college funding. And that's led to the contemporary reality we have today, where indeed the majority of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women. In the late 60s and early 70s, feminism changes to increasingly focusing on institutions of influence, particularly in American culture, critiques of advertising, which tended to reduce women to sex objects, urge American men and women to see women's only value manifest in their bodies or their attractiveness to men. Marcia Janeway was a feminist who advocated for this critique of the beauty culture, which she said was dominated by men, who controls the major cosmetic corporations, the major advertising agencies, men. Those cosmetic corporations, Hollywood, advertisers, market a certain ideal of beauty that urges women to look as different from men as possible, Janeway argued. They urge women to have long hair, wear short skirts, and wear high heels to look as different from men as possible. Her remedy to sexism was an androgynous society where men and women look identical. Her argument was, I can't discriminate against you as a woman if I don't know you're a woman. If everyone looks alike, well, you can't treat people differently. And so she advocated for an androgynous society where men started to dress more like women, women started to dress more like men, and we meet somewhere in the middle. This might seem strange to you, but she too was very prescient. Today, no one raises an eyebrow if men have long hair or women have short hair, or if men wear cosmetics of some sort. You know, today we're all manscaping and rubbing creams everywhere. Nobody raises an eyebrow if women wear pants. 1960s, there were places in American life where women couldn't wear pants, including courts. If a woman was called in for jury duty or to testify in court and she showed up in pants, the judge could send her home and require her to wear a skirt just 50, 60 years ago. But again, thanks to the efforts of Janeway and other feminists, we've challenged that. And so we have recognized, again, there are different ways of being in the world, that men and women should be able to dress as they please. And for Janeway, this was a remedy for sexism. And we may not have seen that yet manifest, but it did lead to the way in which we today have very different attitudes about public appearance in American life. Along with the Feminine Mystique, the other great landmark work of the modern feminist movement of the post-World War II period was published in 1970, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. She argues in this book that every institution in American life was dedicated to keeping women below men. She argued the economy, capitalism, was created by men to deny women the ability to build up wealth and capital, thereby keeping women below men. She argued the American political system was designed by men to deny women political power. And we've talked a lot in this class about how for most of American history, most American women were denied political power. It wasn't until 1920, the 19th Amendment allowed white women to vote, and it wasn't until 1965 that women of color have effectively had the right or opportunity to vote. So Millett reflected that in her critique of a political system. Now it's 1970, and she's critiquing capitalism, the American political order. We are still in the throes and thickets of the Cold War. She's arguing we're not a beacon of democracy. She's arguing capitalism is not emancipatory. If you look at its history, it's been very confining for American women. But Millett also reflected this trend, this turn that I've talked about in the late 60s and early 70s to branch beyond politics into culture. She argued that cultural institutions in American life also advance images and ideas that effectively relegate women to second-class status or limit them to being sex objects. And as her title indicates, she even argued that the sexual act itself was political. She argued that even sex itself is all about men on top and women below them. I know she wasn't thinking of all the kinky ways you guys have been doing it. She argued the missionary position is all about men saying, I'm in charge, I'm on top. She argued in this book that the only reason women think they want to have sex with men is because they've been told that by a man. She argued that if women really wanted to have a good time, they'd get together with other women because they have access to the equipment, they know how to work it best. If women really want to have sexual pleasure, they should again break free from patriarchy and the dominant message in American society and explore their bodies with other women. So Millett's book really demonstrates the range of critiques that feminism was expressing by the early 1970s. However, all of this will spark a backlash, and this too is an analogy to civil rights, as we described it in our most recent lectures. 1960s was a time of transformative change for racial minorities. It led to appreciable change that made America a more free and democratic society. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, a variety of reforms that formalized Jim Crow, but those changes sparked a backlash, and you have that conservative turn in the late 60s, early 70s, one that we'll talk about in greater detail when we turn our attention to the other social movement of the 1960s, the modern conservative movement. Well, feminism follows a very similar pattern. You get remarkable change in law from the federal government, Equal Pay Act, Civil Rights Act. You get a broadening of the movement to challenge many institutions in American life, and you get a backlash to that. In the early 1970s, feminists advanced an Equal Rights Amendment, an amendment to the American Constitution that would end all discrimination based on sex, to effectively make men and women completely equal under law. This was originally promulgated by feminists in the 1920s, who hoped that they would build on the 19th Amendment and advance this Equal Rights Amendment. That, in the 1920s, sparked a conservative backlash amidst the culture wars of that decade. In the early 70s, feminists in this movement, hoping to advance an Equal Rights Amendment, returned to it and passed it through Congress and most state houses in this country. However, conservatives in some state houses voted against this, and the Equal Rights Amendment died. And it remains a dream unrealized, one that people return to and likely will return to soon in the next couple of years, hoping to finally pass this Equal Rights Amendment 100 years after its infancy. The reason why the Equal Rights Amendment has failed, in part, is the conservative backlash that begins in the 1970s and deepens in the 1980s and 1990s, when conservatives talk about family values, critique feminism, use feminism in many ways as a pejorative, an insult. So, much like civil rights, feminism will spark a backlash. And in the decades after the 1970s, many of the goals and aspirations of now Betty Friedan and other feminists will be stymied as the culture wars flare in the 80s and 90s around conservative buzzwords like family values. Let's conclude this lecture by examining the modern gay rights movement that also develops here in this time of social movements and social change. The story of the modern gay rights movement follows a lot of the contours that we've seen recently in regards to the lives of racial minorities and women after World War II. Immediately after World War II, in the late 40s through the 1950s, in that containment era, in that era that emphasized conformity, consensus, people who were gays and lesbians in America faced a great deal of repression. Much like women were told to get married, move off to the suburbs, and dedicate their lives to being wives and mothers, much like racial minorities were told to accept apartheid and second-class status, Sexual minorities in America were told that they were second-class citizens, and they faced a variety of forms of harassment, discrimination. They were associated with communism. There's a very deliberate effort by Joseph McCarthy and other Red baiters in the Red Scare of the post-World War II era to equate homosexuality with communism, implying that every communist was gay and every gay person was a communist. And this was a deliberate effort to malign gay people and to represent them as a threat to American society. We have talked in previous lectures about how during the Cold War era, during the Red Scare of the 1950s, Americans were urged to see communism as a threat to American values, all that Americans hold dear. And so associating homosexuals with communism was a way of representing them as a threat, a menace, representing them outside the American nation. So this was part of the way in which gays and lesbians in the 1950s faced harassment, faced all of these efforts to malign them and represent them as outside the nation and threats to an American consensus. Furthermore, they were harassed by police. They were beaten, much like other American citizens in this period, subject to institutional violence in that way. They were subject to the very selective enforcement of sodomy laws that criminalized sexual acts that heterosexuals engaged in, but it was only homosexuals who were ever prosecuted under these laws. So in the late 40s, 1950s, sexual minorities, much like racial minorities and women, faced these patterns of exclusion, discrimination, harassment. In short, they too were second-class citizens in this nation. However, even in the 1950s, a gay rights movement began pressing against these efforts. The Maniteen Society was a group of brave Americans who in the 1950s, during a time of repression, during a time where so many Americans were urged to see gays and lesbians as threats to the American family, the American nation, here were these people, the Maniteen Society, its members, marching in the streets in cities across the country, bearing signs that said, "I'm a gay American." These were people who were out of the closet, confident and brave in themselves as individuals in a free society, and willing to make such a public statement and declaration during a time of such repression. They were marching in the streets, demanding equality, opportunity, and end to discrimination. Maniteen Society, an early advocacy group for a more generous vision of who is an American that would include gays and lesbians as full and equal members of this nation. But it would be the 1960s where the modern gay rights movement would really flourish, and it does so because of the context that we've now described. The 1960s is a period of civil rights, feminism, student protests. It is a period of the counterculture. It is a period where everything is under investigation, interrogation. New attitudes are developing about who is an American, what does it mean to be free, and that created a context by which gays and lesbians could be more assertive in their demand for equality in freedom in American life. So these different movements we've now enunciated, described, are deeply connected to each other. Civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the counterculture, they overlap, they inspired each other. They were part of a reassessment of American society. They are a key beat in the longer rhythm of the argument without end, where we were thinking differently about these questions of who is an American, what does it mean to be free, and what defines this nation. The key event that marks the gay rights movement of the post-World War II period took place in New York City in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. Stonewall Inn was and remains a gay bar well known to be a place where men went to drink and dance in public. It is still in existence. One of the last things that President Obama did before he left office was to declare it a national landmark, a national historic landmark. It became the very first LGBTQ national historic landmark. So the Stonewall Inn is still there in Greenwich Village in New York City. But in 1969, it was the site of a major confrontation that would spark a broader movement that spanned into the contemporary era. Because the Stonewall Inn was known to be a gay bar where men went to dance and drink together to be free individuals in a free society, it was routinely raided by the New York Police Department, who would go in, arrest these men for simply being who they are in a free society, dancing and drinking together in public, or beat them, crack skulls, literally crack skulls. And so the patrons of the Stonewall Inn were subject to harassment. They were treated as second-class, third-class citizens in this nation that claimed to be a beacon of freedom and democracy. Well, one day, in the summer of 1969, the patrons of this bar had enough. And when the cops went in to do what they routinely did, harass, beat the patrons fought back, beat the shit out of the cops, and the cops had to go running out of the bar. The police called for reinforcements, and they stormed the bar, and the patrons again fought back. Then people in the neighborhood who were sympathetic to the patrons of this bar, who were not necessarily gay or lesbian themselves, but felt sympathy with these people who just want to be left alone, who just wanted to be free individuals in a free society, came into that neighborhood, and they stood with the protesters, and they fought back the police. And so for days, that neighborhood in New York City was awash in this insurrection, this confrontation between the New York City Police Department and gays and lesbians and people sympathetic to their cause in this age of civil rights. The reason why this event is so key is that it turned the attention of the nation towards people who had long been unseen or maligned and vilified. It's much like the occupation of Alcatraz in the same year of 1969, where the American public was urged for the first time perhaps in their lives to think about the plight and experience of Native Americans, the history of colonization and abuse against Native Americans. Here now, Americans were seeing gays and lesbians in a brand new way, as people who, again, simply wanted to be free of harassment, who were subject to institutional authority and power, who wanted to be free individuals in a free society. And because of that, this led to a reassessment of these American citizens. It led to a shattering, a confrontation with stereotypes. Here were gay men beating the hell out of the New York Police Department. So stereotypes of gay men as weak and effeminate melted away here. It's much like the dynamics we talked about earlier when people saw on their televisions African Americans being beaten. It created this moral calculus. It created this confrontation with the self where you had to pick sides. And in the context of social change, different attitudes developing, the countercultural sensibilities that prevailed by the late 60s, the Stonewall Rebellion was a chance for heterosexual Americans to rethink their prejudices against gays and lesbians and rethink their place within the American nation. And that led to the gay pride movement of the 1970s and the following decade, where you had the very first gay pride parades in America. You had an emphasis on coming out of the closet and being free to be who you are in public life. You had great gains for sexual minorities. Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco City Council, the first openly gay politician to be elected to such an office. You had the American Psychological Association in the 1970s finally removing homosexuality from its list of psychological disorders. Yes, not that long ago, 50 years ago. The American Psychological Association, the association that represents psychologists in this nation, listed homosexuality as a mental disease, as a mental disorder. Well, that ended in the 1970s. However, with the greater visibility, with the greater assertiveness of gays and lesbians in the 1970s, with people like Harvey Milk becoming national figures, there was a backlash. And this is yet another way we can put these different movements in dialogue, compare them, and understand their place within modern American history. Just like civil rights sparked a backlash, just like feminism sparked a backlash in the conservative turn of the 1970s, so did gay rights. Anita Bryant was a former Miss America contestant who became an evangelical Christian and made it her cause and concern in the 1970s to work against gay rights. She came to California in the 1970s, when in 1978 there was an initiative on the California ballot that would ban gays and lesbians from working as public teachers in the state of California. Again, this is less than 50 years ago. This is not that long ago that California had such an initiative on the ballot. Again, we tend to think of California today as liberal blue state California, but that's quite a recent development. For most of California's history in the 20th century, it's been a very conservative and reactionary place. More about that, again, in our coming lecture on the modern conservative movement. Here in California, in 1978, there was this Briggs Initiative, and Anita Bryant and others lent their celebrity to this crusade to ban gays and lesbians from working as public school teachers. The initiative didn't pass, but millions of Californians came out to support it. Just like in 2008, millions of Californians came out to ban same-sex marriage here in California. California, in 2008, the same year that it would cast its electoral votes for Barack Obama, making him the first person of color to win the presidency, in that same election, Californians came out and reversed same-sex marriage. Iowa had same-sex marriage before California. So again, we need to be a little bit more thoughtful when we think of California as hippy-dippy California, blue state California, left coast California, where we all drive around in our Priuses and eat organic kale. California, in the late 20th century, like many parts of this country, expressed a backlash against the full equality of gays and lesbians. Harvey Milk may have been elected to the San Francisco City Council, but he was assassinated by Dan White, a man who could not accept sitting side by side on the city council with a gay man. So there's this backlash that comes with this movement for equality, opportunity in the gay rights movement of the late 20th century, which does have a lot in common with civil rights and feminism. What were gays and lesbians asking for? Well, the same rights as any American. They wanted to be free and equal members of this nation, much like Native Americans and African Americans and women. They wanted opportunity. They wanted to pursue an education, a career, open a business, and live life on their own terms, much like the values of the counterculture. But as they aspired to that equality, freedom, and opportunity, it sparked a backlash, and it led to the culture wars of the 80s and 90s, fueled by conservatives and their rhetoric about family values, how they railed against feminism and the undermining of the American family, how they turned every issue, whether it was poverty or crime, into a culture war issue that they could use to secure power. It might seem weird to all of us, all of you, listening to this lecture, but in the 80s and 90s, things like pornography, single motherhood, gays and lesbians teaching in public schools were major sources of political debate in the culture wars of this period. As I've already indicated and will indicate more in our final lectures, today in the 21st century, culture war issues tend to focus more on race and immigration, but in the 80s and 90s, America was assessing the consequences of the counterculture, the sexual revolution, the social changes of the 1960s, and many Americans in the 80s and 90s cleaved in a very conservative direction, which does lead us to our next lecture on the modern conservative movement, which in many ways is the last of these movements that comes out of the 1960s that transforms American society, as we have been examining in this period in the class.